I think the important thing about the early 1980s is, in a sense, the profound shock felt by both sides, or all participants, at the return to the Cold War. For much of the preceding period, these years of détente, there had been this perception that the international climate was heading towards a much reduced level of tension, and that the Cold War was disappearing, perhaps not altogether, but at very least receding to the margins. And therefore it came as a profound shock to East and West when suddenly, from the very late 70s onwards and going into the early 1980s, the international climate deteriorated rapidly, and you returned to a degree of East-West polarization and tension that had not been seen since the early 1960s and the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The atmosphere in the late 70s was a bit hypothetical, that I don't think anybody really thought a nuclear war was on the way. But the moment we got Reagan in, and the NATO build-up, and all the anti-communist, anti-Russian stuff that started in 79, 80, there was an absolutely dramatic change in our world. Our membership developed enormously, and people were generally frightened that there would be a war. So it was a very different atmosphere, the two periods. Within 12 months, it was totally different.
Well, the late 1970s had seen really the collapse of the détente policies, which had been around since the beginning of the 1970s. There were instances where the United States was increasingly suspicious of Soviet foreign policy behavior in places like Africa. The belief that the Soviet Union was building up substantial amounts of strategic arms which could threaten the United States directly in a nuclear war, for a nuclear first strike against US strategic forces. So a belief the Soviet Union was actually taking advantage of some of the arms control agreements that had been reached during the earlier phases of détente. And then this was all capped off in 1979 with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the end of that year, which set East-West tensions off to a very high degree.
Well, I think in the early 1980s there was a striking deterioration in the relationship, particularly between the Americans and the Soviet Union. And this was a sort of product of different factors. One was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The other was, for example, the Soviet development of a new missile system in Europe, the SS-20. A third was the Americans' decision to proceed with a strategic defense initiative, which I think from a Soviet perspective risked undermining the strategic balance. All these things came together, as well as the personalities of the President of the United States and the age and decrepitude of certain leaders of the Soviet Union, to produce a very awkward situation.
The early 1980s, there was a series of developments that led to a revitalization of the peace movement across the continent. And all surrounded this kind of advance in missile technology. So what happened in the wake of the deployment of Soviet SS-20s, that's the missiles that were placed in Europe, the West felt that they had to rebalance what they felt it was a strategic weakness on the part of the West, and there were several decisions that really kind of provided a landmark for peace mobilization. It led actually to the 1979 dual-track decision, which was a decision from NATO members to install a new generation of cruise and Pershing missiles across Western Europe in 5 countries. That was the UK, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy. So all of these developments really exacerbated the fear of nuclear annihilation across the public.
One of the things that makes the Second Cold War so interesting in the UK is that both sides of the debate, notably the UK government on the one side and the UK peace movement on the other, fundamentally they shared the same objective of preventing a nuclear attack on the UK, but they differed fundamentally in the means of preventing a nuclear attack, and even pursued what you can see as mutually exclusive means of preventing a nuclear attack. So the UK government believes that it can best protect the UK by stationing or deploying Euromissiles on UK territory and through solidarity with NATO, and that this would be an effective deterrent that would dissuade the Soviet Union from launching an attack. Now the peace movement, for its part, believed that adding new missiles, more nuclear weapons onto UK territory would actually turn the UK into a target. And so this actually invited nuclear attack rather than deterring one.
What was really absurd about this new generation of nuclear weapons was they were supposed to reassure Europeans that they were safer, that the Americans would come to their aid. But the theory was that the American nuclear umbrella would be more credible if nuclear weapons were based in Europe, because then the Russians would attack Europe rather than America, and therefore the Americans would be readier to use nuclear weapons. Well, that's a pretty terrifying theory if you're European. So I think it just produced, peace groups sprung up all over Europe, and particularly in the places where the missiles were to be deployed.
Yes, it was quite a tense time overall. It was tense in Britain in domestic terms as well, because we had Mrs. Thatcher. She had just come to power. She was forming a strong relationship with Ronald Reagan. He was talking about the Soviet Union being the evil empire. So there were all kinds of military initiatives coming up. There was Reagan's Star Wars initiative, for example. But in the late 1970s, they'd already started to put in place a number of the things that came on stream in the early 80s. So I think it was in 1979 that they announced they were going to bring cruise and Pershing missiles to Europe. Trident coming to Britain was sort of slightly separate, but part of the overall escalation of nuclear weaponry in Europe. So yeah, it was a tense time.